The third tenet, which we discussed yesterday, was Ani Mamin Be'emunah Shlema. I believe with complete belief. Shaboris Baruch Shemo Ina Guf, that the Creator, blessed His name, is not one of corporal form. And whatever is able to affect any entity, any body, he cannot be affected by that. And there's nothing that has any semblance of comparison to what he is. If you read this, if we say he's not subject to anything that any entity is subject to. Now the question is why? There's no such thing. If everything is subject to something, if anything which is finite, that means something exists outside of it. It's finite. That means it exists within some, it has parameters. So that means there's something outside of it which could affect it. But if God is infinite, as we explained, so nothing's outside of God. He cannot be affected, but he affects, because everything emanates from him. Firstly, he's not of any entity or form, and he cannot be affected by that affects other things. And therefore, there's nothing which has a semblance comparison to what he is. So by the last concluding statement is, there's nothing comparable to him, any semblance of comparison. That's exactly why everything which you stated before is as it is, that he's unaffected. The Talmud tells us in one location, and this is something we study on Tisha B'Av, about the tragedies of the destruction of the temple. The Romans destroyed the second temple. And what they did was they took the parochas, that was the curtain that separated between the holy and the holy of holies, and they took all the vessels, the holy vessels of the temple, the gold vessels, and they put it into this curtain. It was a very large, thick curtain, and they wrapped it, and they took it and put it on one of the ships, and they're taking it back to Rome. These are the spoils of the temple. The person who defiled the temple, as the Talmud tells us, first he took a sword, and this was Titus. Titus was the Roman emperor. He took a sword and he put it through the curtain, separating the Holy of Holies. And God allowed that blood came out of the curtain when he put the sword through the curtain. And since the Holy of Holies is the location of God, what he said, this heathen, this monster, this megalomania type person, I killed the Jewish God, because the blood flowing from the curtain was an indication he mortally wounded the God of Israel. The Talmud, whenever it speaks in this context, it says he committed suicide, he killed himself. That's the level of disrespect. So we say he killed himself rather than say what he said, that he killed the God of Israel. He takes all the vessels of the temple, puts it in this very large curtain, puts it on the ship. It's taken back to Rome. As he's on the high seas going back to Rome, all of a sudden gale winds start blowing, and the waves are going over the boat, and the boat is listing, and it's gonna sink with him on it. So he lifts his eyes to heaven. He says, "Sure. Just as you destroyed the Egyptians at the time of the Great Sea, that the armies were caught between the two walls of water, and you had the sea come down on them, your power is on water. So now that I'm in your turf, so to say, your domain, you can destroy me. Why don't you come onto dry land and I'll fight you. We'll go toe to toe." This is what he says to God. All of a sudden, the wind ceases, the sea becomes calm, and God says, You arrogant, measly nothing. The moment you step on dry land, the smallest insect will enter into your nostril, go into your brain, and ultimately that will destroy you. This arrogant, pompous person goes with feeling the glory of the destruction of God's temple with all its vessels. He steps on the dry land. Immediately, this little flea enters his nostril, goes into his brain, and starts gnawing away at his brain. And it's actually driving him insane. And he can't deal with it. And all of a sudden he's walking and he's suffering them. There's no way to stop this insect in his brain. The only way to do it is open up his skull and he would die. So what happens? He's walking down the street and there's a Jewish blacksmith and he's hammering with his hammer on the anvil. And as he hammers, the flea stops being startled by the sound of the hammer hitting the anvil. It ceases to gnaw. So what does he do? He hires a Jewish blacksmith. All day he just should bang away with this hammer on this metal anvil. But you realize it's like, years ago, my mashgiach, who's the dean of men, once said, we find Moshe Rabbeinu, the last 36 days of his life, he speaks to the Jewish people and he recounts the past 40 years, how they failed, and he gives them retribution. He admonishes them, and he says to them, but you realize we were exposed to all kinds of idolatry. In Egypt, as we left Egypt, and we saw, and he refers to their idolatry as putrid rodents and as dung. That's how he refers to the idolatry. Shikutseim esgulaleim, they're putrid rodents and the dung. That the idolatry is the equivalent of a putrid rodent and the dung, which gives off a stench. And of course, he's only expressing this way to them because that's at that moment, that's the way they understood it to be. That's how abominable it was to them. But then immediately says, and if it should be that one of you somehow were attracted to it and influenced by it, you realize what the ramifications and the consequences can be. They can be dire consequences if you were attracted to it. So the obvious question is, if you see it as a putrid rodent and you see it as dung and it gives off the stench of dung, which is intolerable, how could you be attracted to it? So evidently, this is what he said, that with time, although initially something may be repulsive and totally non-coexistent, you can't coexist with it, but if you're in a certain setting, as a human being, we gradually acclimate ourselves to our settings. So initially, we're like taken aback. We repulse it, we cannot tolerate it, but gradually, it eases. And you don't see it as vile, as extreme. And at that moment, you could be influenced. And he used to give the example, all you people are old enough that, most of you, that if you rode the subways, New York City subways in the 50s, you would go onto a subway car. The sound of the subway cars were screeching. It was deafening noise, deafening, literally. And if you'd sit on the subway, the seat, they weren't made of plastic. They were made of like woven type of straw or wicker. They made it like wicker. And it would give such jolts that when you sat on the seat, you could be thrown off the seat onto the floor. That's how it violently jolted, and the sound was deafening. But it was interesting. He said after 5 minutes, all of a sudden you see people are sleeping. How do you fall asleep with all that screeching, deafening noise and jolting and jostling? How? The answer is a human being could be lulled into anything. As violent, as extreme, as deafening may be, it's gradually you get lulled into it. That's what it is. And therefore, initially you see it as putrid as dung, as detestable as a putrid rodent. But if you're exposed to it long enough, you don't see it as so vile and so extreme. And therefore, at that moment, you could be influenced. That's what it is. So initially, when they hammered on the anvil, the flea was startled, stopped gnawing. What happens after a while? The flea got used to the noise. So even though the person hammered all day on this anvil, it didn't disturb the flea continued eating. Till finally, what happened was Titus died. He died that this insect actually destroyed his brain, and he died. Before he died, he gave the order. He gave an order that his remains should be cremated and his ash of his remains should be scattered over the 7 seas. Why? Because if his remains are burnt and they're scattered over the 7 seas, the Jewish God can't locate him. That's what he said. That's why. Okay? After he dies, they open his skull and they find like something which was a monstrous bird. This flea grew into a monstrous bird that its claws were like made of iron. Its beak was made of bronze and its skull it looked grotesque. That's what killed him. And they followed his order. When he died, they burnt him, they cremated him, and they took his ashes, scattered them over the 7 seas. So the Talmud says every day, God takes him and has him burnt. He recreates him, burns him, scatters his ashes over 7 seas, regathers the ashes, recreates him, and this is an event which repeats itself every day of the year until the end of existence. Okay? Titus says to God, sure, you destroyed the Egyptians on the water, so you're trying to destroy me on the water. Let's go into dry land. High noon, we're gonna duke it out, as they used to say. Where's Titus coming from? Don't you realize if God could destroy you on the sea, he could destroy you on dry land? And even everything was said and done. He was arrogant till the last moment, burn me, cremate me, and then scatter my ashes so the Jewish God can't locate me. How did Titus understand this? What is God? He's a power. The Roman emperor himself believed he was a deity. He was a deity. So he's a deity, they're a deity. Where does your power lie? Every angel is the basis for it. That's the deity. That's the power behind what manifests itself in the physical. Therefore, it is arrogance. He could say to God, sure, if you read history, you see where does God's power lie? On the sea. That's where you could destroy the height of civilization. Where he did, we're the height of civilization. Rome conquered the world. And that's where you're going to destroy me. Come on, dry land. God says, not a problem. Dry land, you will be destroyed. But he only saw God as, what is a deity? You're one of many. That means you're a finite being, although spiritual, like an angel, but finite. So now we have the various struggles among the different powers that exist in existence, various deities. God has no form, regardless of what that form is. God is not subject to what anything of form is subject to. There's no semblance of comparison to what he is. Why? Because he's infinite. Infinite, we'll see in a moment, has no beginning, has no end. He's not contained with something else, therefore he can be subject to anything. He emits, he affects, He's unaffected. Ramchal writes, Rabbi Busato writes that what is the basis for suffering and evil and punishment in existence? I'd mentioned him at a Maral of Prague. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, and this is something we say when we begin right before the reading of the Torah. We quote a verse in the Torah. You cleave to your God and you live. You all live today. When you cleave, you people cleave to your God, you're all living today. The base for your success, thriving, and pulsating in life is because you cleave to God. So Maral of Prague explains, what is the basis for life and for all blessing? God himself. So if you cleave to the source of all existence, which is God himself, you're living, you're thriving, and you're advancing. What about if God himself withdraws from existence? Meaning, he emits an energy which maintains existence at a very low level. What happens? A vacuum is created. When that vacuum, that itself is suffering, is deprivation, and it's all not good things, because God withdraws. If he's fully invested, fully involved, the world pulsates, radiates, and advances. If he should withdraw, to what degree does he withdraw? If he would cease willing existence, there's no existence. He still wills it, but he wills it at a very minimal level. It's like, you have a brownout, then eventually you have a blackout. Blackout you're not having, but it's pretty much a very serious brownout. You barely, could see. All levels of illumination have been reduced to nearly, things are not recognizable. Things are disastrous. That's what happens. He withdraws. He's there, fully invested. The world pulsates and radiates. He himself is the one who causes. There's no cause that could affect him. Therefore, he's not subject to anything. And that's God. I always say, a person who's a Wall Street person, they have their, what are they called? They have their rodeo shows. They go traveling around trying to raise money, capital for whatever they're trying to. Man, this person is impressed. He writes this check, that check. One thing I can tell you, there's no check God can't write. If God backs the enterprise, you fly. Not only you fly because he backs it, because he guarantees its success. He'll provide whatever's necessary to bring that about. If you ever notice, you want to raise money for dog and cat hospitals, you can have all the money in the world. Even Purina, they get a tax deduction. Purina, they produce, or Hearts Mountain, they give substantial money for cat and dog hospitals because that's their business. But you see how easy it's to raise money for Torah. Anything of the spiritual realm doesn't come easy. Why? Because that level of achievements comes about with great effort. You need special divine intervention. The world is at a level because they don't appreciate what that is. God says, you want it, you got to find it. Years ago, today, I'm not sure what they do in camps anymore. You used to go to summer camps. There was an activity at night. It was a nighttime activity. It was called treasure hunt. They have a treasure hunt. They would hide certain things, and the campers, they would go with flashlights looking for whatever it was. And if you found whatever they hid, you won the treasure hunt. Finding God in this existence is like that treasure hunt. He's not that obvious. And you need more than a flashlight. You have to used to go look for night crawlers before you went fishing at night with the flashlight, and you pulled them out of the ground. You put in that box with the earth and took them down to the lake to fish the next day. Lahavdil elef avdolos. it's easier to find the nightcrawler than find God in this existence. It's not easy. Because if it would be easy, the achievement doesn't have much value. But because it's so difficult, and despite the difficulty is what? Our own conflicts of interest, our own egos, which interfere, which don't allow us to see it as we should see it. Therefore, we have night blindness. Some people that can't drive at night, they have night blindness. We suffer night blindness 24 hours a day, unfortunately. And you need that certain pharmaceuticals, they produce a certain medication which helps the eyesight, so to say, seemingly improves that you're able to see, and you even could drive at night. Or there's a procedure. It's called Torah. That's the procedure. You get an infusion of that. Barasi, Yetzirah Barasi Torah Tavlin. I've created evil inclination. What's the antidote? The antidote is the Torah itself. King Solomon says in Mishnah in Proverbs, Ner mitzvah Torah or, the Torah is the illuminator. The more you're involved and steeped in Torah, and you're touched by it, your spiritual system becomes activated. It's like you have a computer. You plug it in, but when does it stop functioning? You have to put in the code. When you put the code in, now we talk about processing. The code word is a four-letter word. It's called Tuf Vav Reishe Torah. You put that code word in, and you have an understanding what that word is to a degree, to address it with reverence, and with understanding that it's not just ordinary intellectualism that activates the spiritual system. Because it's just intellectualism, it's like any other physical information. But if it's something which goes beyond intellectualism, that has to do with spirituality. Spirituality activates the spiritual system. And once you have that, all of a sudden it starts pulsating, starts churning out information, and gives you an understanding. You have a roadmap. It's like going through a minefield. You got that roadmap, you could go through that minefield, not being concerned anything's gonna happen. There can be no mishaps. And that's exactly what it is. But God himself, as I said, affects, he's not affected. The tzaddik, the more he's connected spiritually, he affects more than he's affected. King Solomon writes in Proverbs, tzaddik ochel l'sov nafsho. A tzaddik, when he eats, he only eats to save his soul. That's all. The only thing he partakes of this world is enough to save his soul. Means to remain alive and be able to function fully, to be able to do the will of God. That's his relevance to this existence. Outside of that, he's fully invested in spirituality. And because he is, that's why he has that level of clarity to be able to perform as the tzaddik for that reason. God is unaffected. God affects, he's unaffected. There's no semblance of what he is. Nothing exists in existence because he's the creator. As the creator, what preceded creation? Only he. So what it means, only he. He is everything. He's not contained within any parameters. Therefore, now that he wills creation, what is he? He's unaffected. He's not subject to what any entity is affected. They say, the Earth planet is going to burn out after so many, whatever years the scientists say. It's only going to burn out when God says it's going to burn out. 6,000 years, the Talmud says this is part of tradition, Torah tradition, which given at Sinai. 6,000 years, this world ceases to be. Ceases to be. Would anybody believe for a moment, Sodom and Amorah, that was the most fertile, lush location on earth, blessed location, when the cosmic destruction took place, afterwards, you couldn't believe for a moment that anything existed in that location prior to what exists at this moment. Cosmic destruction. When we speak about God's punishment, it says like the fire and brimstone that came down upon Sodom and Amorah. What was that find? That was total obliteration. Obliteration, not that there was the rubble of the destruction. There's no trace of their existence. After 6,000 years, it's even more than that. The world will not exist. Goes back to the pre-ex nihilo. As a result of that, but how does it? Because everything is dependent upon him. When he wills, it is. When he still ceases to will, it's not. You know, it's interesting. You live in today's day and age. When 9/11 happened, there was a certain person who was a very young man, inherited a tremendous amount of wealth. And he said to me, you know, he doesn't feel safe anywhere. He says to me, I think I'm either moving to Sydney, Australia, or I'm moving to New Zealand, because I think that's the safest place to go. And then he wasn't fully observant at all. You understand? If it's meant to happen, of course, we have to behave and act rational, responsible. No question. You can't put yourself in the firing line. You can't live in a war zone. If the whole world is a war zone, you have no choice. You have nowhere to go. So you try to minimize the danger. But if there is a location that's not a war zone, of course, that's where you go. I said to him then, I said, you know, you can't escape. It's a new reality of existence. And I said, if you believe in God and you live God's credo and God's script, and you act responsibly, of course, there's a degree of concern. But you know something? You're not worried, because God, ultimately, he's the one who makes the decision. Otherwise, you cannot find a stone to hide under. Not a stone to hide under. You'll be consumed with, because if you believe that your existence is dependent upon your initiative, on your money, on your capability, on the people you know, once you realize none of that makes a difference, you know what happens? You're terrified. You can't function, you can't sleep. But if you understand that, of course, we have to live responsibly, but ultimately, the bottom line decision is God's. As long as you toe his line, there's nothing to worry about, because ultimately, you're in a good place. Even if you die, you're still in a good place. Because the value of life is only to achieve, and achieve means to do what he wants. Therefore, even if, God forbid, God decides your life should end, but that's God's decision. It's not the human being's decision to take your life, because that person can only take your life if God wants your life to be taken. Just end with one thing. You know, there was a person who attended a Shabbos meal at someone's home and said, you know, at one time there was such a thing as the Torah mind, that their advice was bordering on divine. But we see today it doesn't exist. Why doesn't it exist? Because we see that during the Holocaust, there were many communities, they went to the chief rabbi and they asked them to be advised. Should they leave their communities and flee Europe, or should they stay? And they were great Torah sages, and they told them to stay. And because they told them to stay, that's why they perished in the Holocaust. So you see clearly that divine clarity no longer exists, regardless how great they are. We no longer have these great people. So these people didn't know what to respond. So they called me after Shabbos, and they say, Rabbi, what have you said? Is it true? I said, no. I said, why did the Holocaust take place? Because God wanted the Holocaust to take place. That was a divine decision. Why? We don't know why. But it happened because God wanted it to happen. If God would have advised the chief rabbis to tell the communities to leave Europe, would have there been a Holocaust? There wouldn't have been a Holocaust. So if God wants to be a Holocaust, what is the message from the rabbi who has divine communication? Remain. Is that the right decision? Yes. You know why? Because God wants you to remain. It's the same thing. If a person lives his life with a belief and a reality that there's nothing in existence that takes place only because God wills it to take place, and it does, and all we can do is do our best, and doing our best means live within the parameters which God set for us. So whatever happens, it happens because that's the way God wants it to happen. Therefore, the Holocaust, why it happened? Was it tragic? Was it painful? Was it devastating? The answer is yes. But why? Only God knows why. But therefore, The Torah sages have that clarity, but that clarity comes from God. And God is the one who communicates, and the communication was remain and do not leave and escape.
Yashar Koach. Thank you.
Okay.